Has it started?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. Hi, everyone. I welcome you all to round 6 of Nepal Australs 2021. The way we're going to go about this is that we'll first have introductions and then from the judges and then introductions from the team. And then we will be good to begin. So starting from the judges, hi everyone, my name is Narayan. I don't have any preferred gender pronoun. I'll be your chair. However, I urge you to address the panel as a whole if you're addressing. Just inviting the other judges allocated to this room to introduce themselves as well.
Hi everyone, I am Fatima, she, her, best of luck.
Thank you so much. Cool. Just inviting introductions from both the teams, starting from affirmative in their speaking order, and let us know if you have any preferred gender pronouns as well.
I'm Oliver. I'll be speaking first in reply. Our second speaker will be Sophie, and our third speaker will be Daniel Yim.
First speaker, Brendan, also doing reply. Second speaker, Leah. Third speaker, Udai.
All right, excellent. Just a couple of things before we begin. Please be sensitive of whatever you're trying to talk about. Don't bring generalizations, take cognizance of your words. Secondly, you've already introduced, so I'll be keeping time. The time limit is 8 minutes and 15 seconds. I won't be writing anything beyond 8 minutes and 15 seconds. I'll just raise my hands like this, just indicate that their time is up. And the replies are supposed to be 4 minutes and 15 seconds. Kindly stay within the time limit. I think that's all about it. We can start now, inviting the Prime Minister to open, sorry, the first affirmative to open the case that stands in their name.
Just briefly, before my speech begins, I'd like to wish a very happy birthday to the first speaker of the negative for a few days ago. So happy birthday, buddy. I love you. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Nobody wants to work. We're made to work. We're made by a society that expects two parents to earn enough money to support that family, and as a result, makes wages low and the price of essential goods high. It prevents us from engaging the kinds of pursuits that make our life worthwhile. The pursuits like spending time with our children, the people who are most important to us, spending time exploring who we are and what we care about. And that is the exact burden that this negative team is going to have to defend, the status quo. I'm going to do 4 things in a speech. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, on families. Thirdly, on the economy. And fourthly, if I have time, on some preemptive. Firstly, on setup, 2 notes of setup from this affirmative team. Firstly, we would note that a norm does not equal total adherence in the way that the status quo has a norm of 2 parents working. There are still parents that choose to stay home. That means that the kinds of arguments from the negative team about families that are simply so poor that they require 2 parents to work will not work in this debate, because in those circumstances, those people can still opt into working. They can still make that decision. And if parents particularly care about labor, if they need that financial support, if for whatever reason it is something that they deem appropriate, they're still able to do so. We're talking in generalities in this debate. Secondly, we would note that parents are able to make this decision on multiple different calculuses, but notably with the enormous decision-making calculus in the status quo of misogyny being removed, they're likely to make that decision across rational lines. Things like which parent likes working more, which parent earns more money, which parent is the better caregiver to the children. And that's the exact sort of calculus that we think parents are likely to default to in our world, and the burden is for the opposition to prove why that would not be the case. Let's start by talking about families, because we think the clearest path to victory for our team is explaining to you why this is better for families. Not only for the reason that families are clearly the most important issue in the debate, given that it's where people derive most of the joy in their life and therefore most utility, but also for the reason that it has the widest reaching impacts in this debate. Why do we think it's better for families? We think so on 2 grounds. Firstly, on children, secondly, on parents. Firstly, on children. This is pretty cut and dry. Kids need parents, and in the status quo, they're robbed of those parents. They see their parents from 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock. They see them briefly in the morning. And when they see their parents, they're exhausted and they're not willing to do the sort of work that they need to do. That's important because it means we are continually raising generations without the support of loving parents. And that is something that we as the affirmative team oppose. What changes in our world? The clearest change is that now you have a person dedicated to you at all times of day who is willing to go the extra mile to support you. What impacts does that have? Firstly, clearest impact, early childhood. In early childhood, children require an enormous amount of attention and support. They require that not only for basic learning, for instance, about language, about emotion, about how to treat others, but they also require that for their confidence. They require that for their fundamental basic development. It is a known fact to the average reasonable person that early childhood is a period in which you require enormous attention. The comparative that the opposition have to deal with is either one where you do not receive that attention or one where that attention comes from a non-parent, someone who is intimately less likely to know that child and less likely to care about that child in the way that a parent does. Secondly, we would point out that that child is now able to form bonds with their parents, which is now important because it means that they have a source of continual support from that parent going forward into their life. Which is to say that at any point during your life, you need a shoulder to cry on, you have your parent there. And it's much easier to do so, and those sorts of interactions are much more fluid in a world where that parent has spent an enormous amount of time with you. Thirdly, we would tell you that that parent is able to support you in all the ways that you need, whether that be helping you with your homework, whether that be making you food, whether that be making this house a nice place for you to live in, all the kinds of things that make sure that you feel comfortable, happy, and supported as a child in any way, shape, or form. They're able to provide that for you. But fourthly, we would tell you that that parent can also be a more active disciplinarian, which is to say that if that child is getting into things as extreme as drugs, or even if they're just doing things like being ruder on a daily basis, that parent is better able to preemptively monitor that sort of behavior, but also crack down when it does occur, which means that children are better able to develop in the pathway they need to. Essentially, I can't believe it, but we've had to explain the benefit of parenting. We get more parenting in our world, and the impact of that is truly enormous. It would lead to people who are less like me and more like the first negative speaker, a wonderful guy. Second, let's talk about parents, because we think on the grounds of parents, we even more clearly win this debate. We think so for three reasons. Firstly, because it's better for stay-at-home parents. Secondly, because it's better for working parents. And thirdly, because it's better for women, the clearest margin of difference in this debate. Let's talk about stay-at-home parents. As I alluded to in the introduction, people are at the moment chained to a life of labor. It is, of course, the case that some people enjoy the pursuit of meaning, but we would suggest to you that the vast majority of people who would opt into becoming stay-at-home parents would not be those people, which means this opposition team has to deal with the roughly 50% of people in their world who are now forced into menial labor. We would note that the majority of jobs aren't interesting, like archaeology. They're things like stacking shelves that suck the life out of individuals, that take every waking moment of their day, chained to a corporation that knows them not as a person, but rather as a resource. In our world, that shifts, because now not only are they able to pursue their interests and their passions, thereby getting the sense of vocation that this opposition team does, they're also able to just relax, spend time with the people they love, form bonds with their children. Clearly better for them. Secondly, on working parents, we would tell you that those working parents are now better able to A, have the comfort and security that their child is well looked after, which means that they don't have to perform the dual role of parent and caregiver, caregiver and worker in the same way that puts strain on both of those elements of the relationship. But secondly, we would also tell you that it means that with respect to their relationship with their partner, they have more of the ability to have a healthy relationship when both of them aren't constantly stressed all of the time. But thirdly, and most importantly, on mothers, we would tell you that in the status quo, mothers are expected to be the caregiver. That is because where both parents are, for lack of a better word, workers, they are forced to be the caregiver, because our misogynistic societies tell us that women are better suited for that role. In a world where one person is the designated caregiver, it means that women are freed from the chains of automatically having to be the caregiver while also having to work. And that's problematic because it means that they're not able to fill either of those roles well, and it leads to an enormous amount of unpaid, uncared for emotional labor. But secondly, we would tell you that to the extent that women and any caregiver in our world is performing that role is more legitimized and more respected in society, not only for the reason that it is seen as something that is normatively okay for people to do, but also for the reason that it is seen as an essential part of the average person's life that they will likely participate in at some point or another, which means that when they do perform those caregiver roles, they're more respected, they're more likely to receive government support, and they're less likely to be derided for that. That is the reason why it's better for families, clearest margin of victory in this debate. Next, let's talk about the economy. Sophie will likely expand on this in a second. The economy in our world is one where wages will rise and the price of essential goods will drop. That is a benefit not only for parents, but for everyone. It is a benefit for the families that just have a mother and a father, they do not have children. It is a benefit for the single individuals. It is a benefit for the elderly, because in our world, there is far more market power afforded to workers and there is far less market power afforded to corporations. Why is that the case? Firstly, let's explain why wages rise. We would suggest to you that with an undersupply of labor comes additional bargaining power for those laborers, which is to say that corporations still require that labor to be done, but there are fewer individuals in the marketplace able to do so, which means that each of those individuals has more of an ability to ask for more money. We would note that corporations have the ability to give them that money in the status quo. They simply choose not to and give it back to shareholders or reinvest it back into the company. Corporate profit growth is an all-time high, but wage growth has stagnated since the 1970s across most of the world. That indicates to you that the money is there, they're just choosing not to give it to it. And that's because we have an oversupply of labor in the status quo. We know that corporations will know that it is in their own best interest to pay people more when those people aren't necessarily the ones that they need to be working in their factories, in their businesses. But secondly, we would also tell you that for the direct micro instances of deciding whether you want your worker to be the one who chooses to stay home or the one who chooses to stay on, you're likely to pay them more. Which is to say that if, for instance, the mother is an engineer, the father is a doctor, both the medical practice and the engineering company don't want that worker to be one who chooses to stay home. So they additionally incentivize them to come and work for them. So that is why wages rise and all the benefits we suggest will occur. But secondly, we will tell you that moreover, the price of essential goods will drop, which is essentially just because even if it is the case that people have way less money in our world, that just means that people can't price themselves so high that nobody ever buys their products. Housing prices will drop. The price of basic things like cars and education will drop. And all of that is a benefit that can only be claimed by our team and flows onto all of society. Sophie will expand more in a second. Very proud to affirm. Happy birthday, Brendan.
I thank the first affirmative speaker, inviting the first negative. Here.
Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. The first thing I'll do in this speech is provide some setup on the comparative that we have to defend. Then I'll explain why this is better for the people in the relationship and why both parties working and sharing the load of raising kids is a good thing for both of them. And then finally, I'll explain why this particular norm being reintroduced would be very, very bad for the economy. And that would harm everyone. So firstly, onto the question of setup. I think there was a little bit of kind of like dark magic and elements of that speech where it was almost implied that the setup, the comparative that we had to defend on side negative was a version of the status quo. However, as the topic slide tells us, we're asked to imagine a world where people are equally likely to opt into either staying at home or working. And I think that probably quite clearly implies that we're talking about a world of at least significant, if not almost total gender equality, right? You're talking about a world where if it were the case, we're both like members of the, where like men and women were equally likely to go back to work in the home, and there was no question of like male status or male honor involved in being the person who was the breadwinner, it's probably pretty likely that's a world where those kind of patriarchal norms have decayed a fair bit. And so you can expect at least a reasonable degree of like, labor sharing within the home. It means women, that push about women being the ones more likely to be expected to do work in the home is probably not something they can claim. This debate is obviously not a debate about their world versus the status quo. We're asked to imagine a world with a particular set of conditions and then asking, given that world, what arrangement would be best? People, one partner staying at home, one working, or both partners working and sharing the load of taking care of the home. So the first thing I'll do in this speech is explain the impact upon the relationship. The first thing I want to point out here is that this is and I'm going to kind of explain why it's going to be bad for the homemaker and bad for the person who works and bad for the relationship. But I want to talk about the way in which this is likely to be quite path dependent, and the choices that people make in their lives are likely to be determined quite early on, and that they may find it hard to break out later. And that deals quite effectively with the claim from First Affirmative, which is like, oh, well, people will be able to do this in a pretty rational fashion. They're going to negotiate with quite easily and slip in and out of these particular roles without too much worry. I think the core problem with that is that education, right, and like education generally is typically quite expensive. The problem there is that you in the world where like now 50% of the workforce doesn't work, there are kind of two options. Either a lot of people get very expensive educations and then don't make very much use of them and you don't really see a return, or people are discouraged to not get an education earlier. They're discouraged to kind of get on the homemaker path. Perhaps, for example, in this other world, you'd see the growth of things like homemaker schools or like parenting schools, or like, you would have the growth of other things that you would do that would not be quite the same thing as getting the full university of education. And all of that means that you push the point in time in which people have to make a decision to be the person who goes home or be the person who stays home to earlier in their life. And you think about the history of this, and it kind of makes a fair bit of sense. Like, when this was the case and it was predominantly a patriarchal thing, there was kind of alternate like schools set up that women, a lot of women would attend, etc., etc. Obviously, that's still true in many places today. The key thing here then is that it's unlikely that people would have the ability to really have maximal choice. You'd have to make that choice pretty early on, maybe when you hadn't even met the partner that you wanted to marry, or maybe before you really kind of knew exactly what your preferences were. But it would be quite difficult, for example, to go back to university. It'd be quite difficult to break out of that path once you're in. So given that context, why is it likely to be bad for the homemaker? And the key thing here is that earning an income creates a very large power asymmetry within the relationship. And the other side was like, oh, work's so bad, work's terrible. And that's true, like some jobs aren't very good, but earning an income is an incredible source of social status, which is why many people continue to do it, right? You're able to get access to the ability of calling yourself the breadwinner within the household. And that gives you a lot of cachet and gives you a lot of power. Additionally, when you're a worker, you're going out in the world and you're experiencing new things. You're interacting with people. You have a much broader and richer community in terms of your co-workers than the person who may be staying at home, maybe limited to like the friends among the other parents in the school district. And the other key thing here as well is you experience a lot more kind of sense of accomplishment and personal growth, right? The praise we offer parents is often quite generic. It's often, oh, they're such a good mother, such a good father. They do this, they do that. It's all relatively simple. And that's because most home labor is like pretty like drudgery. Like it's quite like sort of it's just kind of the same stuff again and again and again. But the praise you receive at work is often much more specific to you and the actual things you've done during that particular workday or the particular tasks or problems that you've solved. So it's much easier to feel a sense of meaning there. What does that mean? It means that the person who's the homemaker is stuck in that world of relative drudgery. They don't have access to the income and the social status that comes with being a work, comes with being someone who works and earns an income. And therefore, you just are locked out of that and it creates a power asymmetry within the relationship. It means that it means that like if someone dies or undergoes, if the partner that you're married to who's the worker, they die, you go through a divorce, you have to do a very hard process of readjusting to entering back in the labor market. It might be quite intimidating. You feel less socially confident because you weren't out in the workforce for that long. You didn't have the income, you don't have the savings base, you have to take a lower paying job. All of that harms you. And like think back to why we had, why a key push for the feminist movement was divorce laws. It was because divorce could be absolutely ruinous for a woman were she able to try and push it because of how economically dependent she was on the partner. Imagine that without the kind of gendered connotations, people would still be very, dependent upon their partners. Think about the power dynamics that enables within the household. The second thing, why is it bad for the person who works? It's often bad for the person who works because because their social status is now tied to the role of breadwinner, they have to earn, right? And this is really important because the concept of work-life balance, something that firms and employees negotiate, is built on the idea that you use your life balance to interact with your family. But if the norm now is that one person does all the home stuff and does all the family stuff, it's now much more capable for companies to demand more of your time and demand more of employees more generally. And you feel hard because you can't opt out of that and you feel socially pressured to do it because everyone does it, right? And that means you work more, you interact less with family, you work harder. Think of the ways in which the people who don't see their kids very much and have to work very much and don't get access to all the benefits of having kids and also all the difficulties of juggling those responsibilities. At the end of this point then, you see two people, and neither of whom can really empathize or connect with the other. The person who's the homemaker can't empathize with the difficulties and the stresses of work. The person who's the worker can't empathize with the difficulties, the loneliness, and the drudgery of being a homemaker. And both of them believe that their suffering is more important than the others, which means they're desperately trying to prove to each other that they're the one who has it the worst, that they're the one who needs the most support, which means they become very, very defensive. It's why these relationships often fail. It's why divorce is much more likely on our side and all the pain that divorce can come because these people don't understand each other. Second argument then, why is this bad for the economy? Obviously, this reduces the working age population by potentially as much as half, if not by a very large amount. That means we get less things, we get less services, we get less plumbing, we get less houses built, we get less medical care. The quality of life of everyone goes down because you don't have people doing tasks and then earning income and then reinvesting that income back in the economy. You get less innovation because people aren't at work as much. They're not thinking about problems in the economy that could be solved and ways in which we can make things more efficient. And crucially, given the context of this debate is likely to be, a kind of developed nation, right? What we're talking about here is a context where the population is aging. The dependency ratio of workers to non-workers is already going to become very difficult to manage in the future. The welfare state has already become very difficult to fund, but in a context where now we're also taking half people out of the workforce and those people aren't earning income, the size of real GDP will shrink and it will become harder to pay for pensions and to pay for a healthcare system. Their claim was like, oh, well, workers will have more market power because there'll be fewer workers and they have more bargaining power. But that just misses the fact that when there are fewer workers, there's just less stuff. Like prices don't go down, we have less goods, they become more scarce. And in real terms, everything becomes more expensive. I've got some responses here in case they clock as labour. And a final thing I want to close with here is like, over the past century, there's been a series of labour-saving innovations at home, which is why we've been able to lead. Being a homemaker used to be a very labour-intensive task. Like ironing used to take hours. It now takes 10 minutes. That's why people could leave and find jobs elsewhere. This is trying to return us to an ahistorical attempt to try and turn us to a norm that should not exist and has had its time. Incredible.
I thank the first negative, inviting the second affirmative. Here.
Hey, sorry, just checking that I'm audible. Yep, give me 1 second, yep. Sorry. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, this debate requires you to exercise your imagination, and the negative team does not. They say home labour is unchangeably drudgery and workplace labour will always confer prestige. In our world, things are different because domestic and emotional labour is real, respected, practiced, and understood by many people in this world, not across gender lines, in a way that means things are likely to be different. They need to be imaginative in the way they approach things in this debate, not just take the world as it currently is. So, a number of things in this speech. Firstly, I'll clarify why these roles are fluid and relatively easy to transition between, even if you need to. Secondly, I'll talk about families, and finally, economics. Firstly, why are these roles fluid? Their claim is that you lock people in early on and mean that, for instance, if you are the partner who is going to stay home, you just don't get an education and you're locked into that role. This argument falls apart for a number of reasons. Firstly, because it's very unlikely that you would opt out of education even if you did want to be a stay-at-home parent, for instance. It's not likely that you would go to stay-at-home parent school, as they suggest. That seems very expensive and weird and difficult. It's more likely you get that knowledge, for instance, from your parents or from other people in your life who you understand that from. But secondly, I would say there are just other reasons to get educated, right? We think there are other reasons like fulfillment, like the fact that it's often government mandated in some places, like family pressure, if your parents, for instance, want you to opt into a job. So it's likely that people access education for many of the similar reasons they do on our side. But the third and most important response is that even if that isn't true, transition between the two roles is still likely to be easy. Firstly, because there's likely to be infrastructure in our world which lets people into the workforce. And more importantly, because the reason it is difficult to transition between being a stay-at-home parent and working in the status quo in the world outside of this debate is because you are in competition with people who didn't take time off, right? With people who have never stayed home to raise a child. What we do on our side is that we allow different parents to do this. And the final thing we just explained is that there just really isn't a need. We think if it's correct that one partner would significantly prefer to opt into doing this, to opt into staying at home because that's just their personality and interests, that is fine. And we think there's less financial need for you to do this for reasons that we explain at Ollie and that I will rebuild later on. So that's why you can kind of opt into these roles in a relatively fluid way. Even if you can't, it's still better for families. So the first thing I'm going to look at here is the partner who stays home, because this is where the majority of attacks that we hear from this negative team come from. We explain that things are likely to be better for the partner who stays home because work in the workplace sucks for most people across history, across the world. And you now have way more time to do other things, to spend time with your children, to pursue other interests. If we are considering the vast majority of people, work is menial labor and children and stay at home are nicer than that. Couple of responses they give here. The first and strongest one is to suggest that there will inevitably be a power dynamic between the partner who works and the partner who stays home because working confers money and prestige. Again, this runs into the problem I pointed in my introduction, which is a lack of imagination and ambitiousness with how the world will change, because working in a workplace only confers power this argument only stands where working does confer power and staying at home does not. But that's not the case for the world we defend. Firstly, because doing this is gender balanced, right? It is not the mother's role. And the reason why we have historically degraded domestic labor is because it has been women who are doing it. It is not because that work is less important or less valuable. They suggest like we just have dishwashers and stuff now. Clearly that is just like insufficient. Being a stay-at-home parent, raising children, doing emotional labor, organizing people's lives, all of that is hugely important work, which we think would be respected on our side. But secondly, I would say other norms have changed just across the course of history in a way that means these relationships are less likely to be unlikely to be unbalanced. For instance, norms in relationships about sharing money, about sharing bank accounts. So you cannot compare this debate to like the world in the 1940s because we think other things have gotten better, even aside from the gender equality bit that is specified in the motion. But thirdly, I think things are likely to change even further than that in our world because domestic labor is now seen as legitimate because both partners are likely to do it, or you're likely to have had people in your life, men and women, who have that as their full-time job and can attest to its importance and its difficulty. And that also means you're more likely to, for instance, domestic like roles in the workplace, which are seen as a form of domestic labor. So for instance, like cleaning, and being a secretary or whatever, that kind of emotional labor is more likely to get paid for well. You're more likely to be able to negotiate good wages for it because of that. And it's very unlikely stay-at-home parents will resent the partner who works. Firstly, because you've opted into that role for the reasons we give you at Ollie. But secondly, because given the fact that a lot of labor in the workplace is not super fun and you're getting to spend time and hang out with your kid, there's probably going to be a pretty favorable comparison between you. But the final thing is that even if you don't buy the fact that there is not a power dynamic, for the analysis I give you in my first issue, it's likely partners can move back and forth in different years between those two roles, which is why it stands. The final claim they make is, well, your stuff you're rewarded for in the workplace is stuff that individually reflects on you, unlike housework. That's clearly untrue. The way you perform as a parent, the way you care for your child is clearly individually important. It reflects on you well, and that is meaningful work this opposition team needs to explain with more analysis why it isn't. But next look then at the partner who works. And this is where they make their slightly more plausible claim. They say maybe your jobs can just ask more of you. But there are three problems with this. Firstly, this is the status quo where jobs demand a huge amount of these two partners, right? Both of whom are working, but it's very hard for them to, make good on that. We explained that secondly, in our world, you lose the pressure to care in addition to your work, do your work in the workplace, right? You lose the pressure to also have to pick up the kids from school, to also make dinner and clean the house, which is why you're actually much less likely to be stressed and pressured at work because you only have that one role. And note thirdly, that we allow both parents to become experts in their respective fields. So it's not just that you're a kind of bad worker and a kind of bad parent, you're really good at the thing you do. And note this applies even if you're transitioning between roles, you still become an expert by being a stay-at-home parent for 1 or 2 years, then moving back into the workplace. But that is why it is far better for both sides. Note finally on our material about why it's best for children, no engagement here. We explained that a dedicated caregiver is incredibly important. It means you get support and monitoring, you get logistical support, it's easier for you to be socialized, all of that kind of stuff. No response to this. And it's hugely important because even if we make parents slightly worse off, you have to trade that off against all kids being better off. That is a more important number of people with a bigger impact in this debate. So finally then on economics, they make two claims in response to our material. The first claim is to suggest, well, there are fewer workers, which is bad. Firstly, we explained that at the moment, there is an oversupply of labor, right? A lot of jobs are, not important or there's just an oversupply in companies, so it's good when you have fewer workers. But secondly, that the harms they suggest that come from having fewer workers don't stand because innovation doesn't come from having a bigger workforce. You need good people. You need the kind of jobs that would be innovative, which are not the vast majority of jobs we're talking about in this debate. And you need a good workforce, which is what you get through, for instance, dedicated child rearing that makes the generation coming up more intelligent and more innovative. But we just think the claim that companies will shut down because they have fewer people is way less plausible than our material, which is that wages go up when there are fewer people and you are more likely to do good work at your job when you are paid better there. We explain that there are fewer workers, that means there's more competition and bargaining power among them, and that each corporation individually has an incentive to get their own worker to stay, which is an additional reason why wages go up. We also explain that just the price of goods drop because even if you have less money, that means prices go down because you can't be priced out of that. Additionally, I'll note that governments step in and fill gaps more easily on our side because there's not the expectation that every family family will just be able to fund themselves, or the perception that that will happen on the basis of those two workers, governments are more likely to put in good policies in favor of families and working families. And note that's good for families. It's also good just for every worker within our economy. And that's why I'm very proud to propose.
All right. I thank the second affirmative speaker, inviting the second negative. Whenever you're ready, here.
I'll start my speech in 3, if I'm audible, 2, 1. You don't need to have imagination if you can look to the past. If you can look at history, an economics textbook, for example, and you can understand how the changes that we have faced, how the norms of both parents going to work have directly contributed to economic growth, have directly improved the lives of children, and that in the countries that they talk about, where companies take the most profit, where parents share the most labor, we actually also see the highest quality of life in this debate. And that was a reality that they needed to deal with, because while they could use their imagination is not as smart as the process of evolution, as the process of historical fact that we can look to make educated decisions when judging this debate. First issue I will discuss is fluidity, because note that they lose a lot of their benefits if they want to choose fluidity as a big winning gotcha moment for that case, right? If they say that fluidity is a huge thing that is going to happen on their side of debate, they also approach closer and closer the status quo, but they do it in a way that was uniquely harmful, right? Because they say that, look, you're going to be fluid, you're going to become an expert in both things, but that comes at the cost of efficiency. It means that people chop and change between two industries that are totally unsuited for each other, and that everybody gets worse at absolutely everything they do. Parents get worse and workers get worse, which meant that this was going to be a really bad model, as opposed to the model of ultimate, fluidity that we have on our side of the debate, where things only happen for 2 years, where we don't expect a family to, for their entire 50-year life together, always have one person who is at home and at work. Rather, they can have long periods of time where they both work, long periods of time where they both care for their children. That was far preferable and was a weird thing for them to try to win with. But they told you other things. They told you, look, no, we don't have to defend less people getting educated, because it's unlikely people would opt out of being educated. There's a bunch of reasons why they want to be. So that means that this side of the house is choosing to stand by a world where people go into $50,000 debts all the time to become educated and never apply their university skills to a real industry, never take that through to a job and work. Or if they do, they only do it for like random 2-year periods throughout the next 50 years of their life, literally never get promoted, never change, never stay at the same company for like a significant period of time. That was horrible. That was a waste of human capital. That was a waste of people's time. And that was also just an illogical assessment of how people make decisions, because the cost of getting that education was so high that they would also be worse at making a partnership later on. It meant that they had less options with who they got married to, and it was something they weren't likely to do. So fluidity, weird push, but thank you for agreeing that the status quo is probably better for people. Let's now go on to the impacts on children, because this is really easy for us to win. They tell you that kids need parents and currently are robbed of them. I would argue that if we believe all the fluidity analysis that we get from Sophie, and even if you don't, that we do have currently the best quality of life for children that we have ever seen, especially in countries where we have a very strong norm of both parents going to work. And that was for a couple of reasons. They told you that early childhood people need a lot of support and attention. They don't receive that, or if they do receive it, it might not come from their parent. Couple of responses. The first is that on their side of the debate, they only get that relationship between child and parent with one parent, as opposed to a relationship with both. And this was uniquely harmful in the first 5 years of a child's development. because the impact of gender modeling after one gender has a massive impact on the plasticity of a child's brain in those first 5 years. So what it means is that half the world is going to be modeled after a father who is looking after everything in the home, and a mother who absolutely never gets involved in those activities, and a mother who comes home from work really, really late at night, who they never see that they don't have a relationship. And the other half of the world is going to have the same thing with the gender norms flipped, right? Which means you've got two classes of children growing up. You've got one class of children growing up who believe, well, I am a boy, so I must do X, and the other class of children who growing up believe I am a girl, so I must do Y. And that's really harmful for them in a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it can shape their future choices and further bring forward the decision-making process of whether you are the homemaker or the worker, because you are likely to copy whatever your parents did. Just look at the number of people you meet who work in the same industry that their parent did, or the fact that they're more likely to go to university if their parent did. And that's always stronger for the parent that you have more exposure time to. But secondly, even if it doesn't affect their life choices, it meant that they were not going to get a balanced depiction of gender attitudes and gender norms that exist within society, or, you know, even a balance between personality traits of two different people that shape them when they're growing up, which means that anything bad that parent does, anything that that parent is unlikely to be an expert in, becomes that child's only source of modeling, and they are highly likely not to develop beyond that. And that was because on our side of the house, when parents were busy with work but still spent some quality time with their children, it meant that children got exposed to a range of adults, but also that those adults were experts in the educational field. So when they went off to preschool because their parents had to work, they were more likely to read educational books. They were more likely to have access to toys that shape their development and that teach them things. They were more likely to talk to other children. On their side of the house, you remove the incentive to ever send a child to preschool or even to school, because you have someone who's got the next 18 years of their life at least where they're expected to stay at home. They won't want to send you to school because they're going to be bored as shit without you. They're going to keep you at home. And Sophie literally said that people will not in their world ever go to parenting school. So that means that whatever generational parenting tricks they picked up from their family are the exact ones that they're going to use to raise you, which means that we slow down the progress of children in society. We don't get educational professionals intervening and helping them develop, and we are more likely to get a lot of kids who are really traumatized and fucked up when they finally become an adult. This was egregious and was debate winning in and of itself. But let's now look at the impacts on the economy, because you have to believe a lot of incorrect things to let this economic analysis fly. The first one they say is that when wages rise, prices drop. Anyway, like the price setting relation, one of the biggest inputs is the cost of labor. The higher that cost of labor, the higher the price must be to justify producing 1 unit of that profit. But let's believe their push, which is like, oh, now firms stop profit maximizing, so they use that to like make up the difference in the price setting relation. They drop the goods price. This is equally horrible, because if you remove profit maximizing behavior from firms, you remove the biggest source of economic growth that we literally have in the world, but also you prevent firms from having any excess capital to invest in, you know, machines to produce extra output, in research and development, in going public and receiving, you know, like funds from investors who they can then use to improve their company. And all these things allow them to eventually lower costs when they can have economies of scale and economies of scope. So we got lower prices on our side. But thirdly, even if you want me to ignore the world of microeconomics, I can disprove this argument with macroeconomics, which is that when wages go up this high, but lots of the world is not even working, every family has less money, right? Aggregate demand therefore goes down, because as a family, you have to cut your discretionary spending. But on the same side of that, aggregate supply also goes down, because there are 50% less people at work, 50% less bakers making loaves of bread for you to buy. So when you look at the macroeconomic model of equilibrium, it literally shifts so far left that output is going to drop by billions and billions of dollars. And then they tell you, this is excellent because now people can stay at home and enjoy their hobbies. What? Staying at home is going to be the worst. We're going to have less technology. You're not going to be able to afford a TV. You're unlikely to have enough food to feed your family. That's not a relaxing holiday of work. That is watching your children starve and live in a world where everyone has less utility and less access to goods and services. It's also a world where schools get worse, and all of their things about government intervention were wrong, because governments couldn't collect as much taxes because no one was earning any wages because they weren't in the labor force. Like, so on so many levels, economically, this was disastrous. But this utility, like utopia that they want to tell you about, I mean, sort of sounds like the world before we ever got the Industrial Revolution, when we were in a trapped cycle, a Malthusian trap of growth, where nobody lived a very good life and people just died, and that was the only thing that ever improved economic outcomes. Impacts on going to work and staying at home within relationships are not that important when you look at these two things in the debate, but people fight way more, and that still wasn't responded to. Sounds like a shit time to me.
I thank the second negative speaker, inviting the third affirmative whenever you're ready. Here.
Can I get a sound check?
You're audible, yes.
Thank you. I'm sorry if that sounded weird. I was otherwise occupied mentally. That did sound weird, didn't it?
Sound check?
Oh boy. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First thing I want to talk about is history. They call us ahistorical, then do this crazy correlation versus causation thing. I'll get into that weird doomsday economic stuff later, but I'll probably say the reason that most dual worker economies are so developed is probably because by and large, they're Western beneficiaries of colonialism and a bunch of all other factors. All I want to say here is that this team can't run away with the debate by making this about, well, countries that are big currently have 2 parents working. Let's knock that out of the debate as a starting point. But we're going to win this debate on the issues, unlike this team. Firstly, children. Secondly, economy. Thirdly, parents. Let's start with children. This is where the debate should be centered, because children not only then become the parents who the rest of the debate is about, they also become the workers. Raising those children well is not just important for their function economically or productively, but it's also important for their happiness. It's important for their development as people. It's important to make sure that we don't raise generations of people traumatized by the fact that the evolution that these guys wanted to talk about, i.e. the evolution to rely on a parent, has been disrupted by the fact that economies shackle parents to the workplace and do not allow for those natural support cycles to occur. To all of the weight of that material, we provide you at first and whip at second. The first response we get is from the second negative speaker. They say 2 things. The first is that when you only have one parent, you'll be socialized in a gendered way. 5 reasons you should immediately discount this. Firstly, it's an incredibly sexist and homophobic argument. Obviously, men and women are not so different that they can't socialize children in an effective way to cater to all people. But also, we would ask whether this team then thinks that same-sex couples can't effectively socialize children because there's only one gender present in the home. Ridiculous. Secondly, you still get some of both of your parents. You know, they work during the week. You still see them on the weekend. Thirdly, no engagement with the actual mechanisms of our material, which are about the fact that it's presence, it's monitoring, it's support, not gendered things which are important. This argument doesn't engage. Fourthly, you obviously get other forms of socialization from your teachers, from your community, from your friends, from the rest of your family. And we just think it's crazy to suggest just because there isn't constantly a parent of an equal amount of both parents' genders within the home at any one time, you can't be socialized by other people who are from a diverse range of identities and backgrounds. Finally, we would say that to the extent that they say, well, you'll only be thankful to one of your parents for sticking by you, we say the much more likely characterization is you're thankful to both of your parents for the different things that they've given you. We say, especially as children grow up, they are unlikely to see the sacrifices made by their other parent, chaining themselves to the workstation and providing for their family as something which did not matter. But notably, there's also a contradiction here, right? If work is the thing which is so prioritized and status holding in their side of the house, then clearly this argument doesn't make sense. I'll explain why that argument fails as well, but I just thought I'd note the contradiction which makes their case self-defeating. The only other claim is that parents have an incentive to, and this is just crazy, keep their children home out of fear of boredom and becoming overly attached. 3 reasons this argument is just crazy. Firstly, the generational knowledge passed down to you is likely to be the opposite of this, which is that parents acknowledge where they've gone wrong. They've acknowledged where they've overstepped or overreached into their children, and they'll probably tell you to if you love someone, let them go. Secondly, parents don't need to hold on to their children to enjoy life at home. Leah has this doomsday economic scenario about how we won't have anything to consume. I'll deal with that later. But if you just don't believe the scale of that for 1 second, it's very hard to believe people can't find ways to entertain themselves at home. Just watch Netflix, pursue your interests, have friends, do anything other than chaining your child and stopping them from going to school was the suggestion. Just crazy. But finally, we'd point out the most plausible characterization of the way parents behave is if you love something, let them go. Let them go to school. Let them flourish. Let them make friends. No analysis to overcome that very intuitive argumentation. This debate is primarily about children because they are who will become everyone and they are the ones who need our support right now. Udai needs to do a lot of work to rebuild any semblance of argumentation as to why this team can match us on children. Now, let's deal with the economy, because their way of outweighing the children stuff is basically to just say that if the economy is shit, then, well, everyone's life is going to be shit. So many problems with this. Their first claim, if there are fewer workers, there is less stuff. Firstly, no engagement with the oversupply of labor at the moment. We explained to you, we know that oversupply exists because of things that the reasonable average voter would know. Stuff like wage stagnation despite increasing productivity suggests an oversupply of labor. But secondly, we would note it's far more plausible that if companies need to keep slightly more workers, they would raise wages instead of just allowing the industry to collapse and not producing as much stuff. As we said to you from first, this is a norm which is operating in general, but obviously in extremely labor-intensive industries where for some reason you're losing all the parents, you're likely to increase wages a little bit to encourage them to stay home and their other partner, them to stay at work and their other partner to stay home. The next claim is second, paying workers more is bad because growth will be held back by the fact that companies don't have as much excess capital. Firstly, we would say the amount that companies spend would probably be roughly the same, but it's just funneled into more wages for an individual worker as opposed to expecting multiple people to stay there. And that's all supported by our productivity analysis and declining wages. But additionally, it's in direct contradiction with their next claim, which is people won't be able to buy as much stuff. Because if wages are high, and that is somehow stemming in productivity, you can just spend the money that you've been given and that money makes its way back to the corporations. For a side which is so concerned about economics, they clearly haven't opened their textbook in a while because wages don't just stay with the household, they get spent and they continue the cycle of growth. But next, we would suggest that even in our worst case scenario, which is that this is disastrous and so many people are staying home and not making money, but at the same time, wages are going down and at the same time, people aren't buying enough. This is just this type of situation with government stimulus. It's just the solution. No explanation about why that's unlikely. And we provide you mechanization at first to explain why if staying at home is so common, why that staying at home becomes normalized, then this is exactly the type of political tipping point which would lead to more economic support for families. Now, this is all an attempt to outweigh our stuff with frantically going through an economics textbook. But if you think about it for just 1 second, a lot of their arguments are counter-secular, and I've explained why they're unlikely to be reality. But also, I would like to give you a sniff test, which is, did the economy work when a lot of people stayed home? The answer is yes. Growth was high, wages were high in the 1950s in countries like the United States. That's the history. The average reasonable person knows it. No explanation about why it would be any different. Let's talk about now parents. With their economic stuff, not a reasonable, kind of standing up to our children material, all they have is that parents will be worse off. Their first claim is that employers will expect more from workers. 2 reasons why this is wrong. Firstly, in the status quo, employers already seek the maximum they can without their workers quitting on both of the parents in the workforce, meaning that both parents are already overworked, meaning there's not a meaningful change. But secondly, we explain that this is likely to be cancelled out by the other pressures being removed. So even if you have to work more, you don't have to go home and take care of your entire house. So at best for this side, that argument is symmetric. The next claim, you make choices early to be a stay-at-home parent and then end up being constrained by it. Why is it early? No explanation. That's our first response, which is to say that if there's no reason why people would know which one they're going to be. Men and women are equally likely in our world. Why would suddenly heaps of people make up their minds so early? But secondly, I'll point out another contradiction. Even if you don't buy that analysis, right, it's self-defeating. Because the harm they say of making this decision early is that you get locked out of the prestige of being the worker. But if being the worker is so prestigious, you're unlikely to lock yourself out from being able to be the worker. And no, that contradiction doesn't affect our case. This is their mechanism and it's self-defeating. Secondly, they say you'll be constrained by the choice. Firstly, going back to work is likely to be normalized on the outside of the house. Secondly, as we explained to it second, it's unlikely there's going to be a trade-off in terms of education. They say, well, student debt is bad. Firstly, it's likely to be cheap on the outside of the house if university education isn't associated with the job necessarily. Secondly, it still pays off for both of you because you have more flexibility. If both of you could work, you're going to get higher wages for the household in general. Thirdly, we still pay it off for society because educating people is good for society. Their final claim is that staying at home sucks. A lot of this relies on the status intuition pump at first, which we deal with at second. But their power dynamic material also doesn't stand up to even the slightest bit of scrutiny, because we explain to you the ways that the power dynamic only exists as a result of gender dynamics. It's likely to be countered by all the changes which happen in our world. And ultimately, even if you don't believe any of that material, it's massively outweighed by the fact one parent gets to stay home and that it's actively a good thing. Bonding with that child, pursuing their interests, making friends are things that make status such an unimportant consideration in this debate. Beyond sexism and homophobia, this team is going to have to say something about children in order to have a chance in this debate. And I would suggest third negative is too late. Their fate is sealed.
I thank the third affirmative. Just give me like 30 seconds. I'll just stretch my charger out. My battery is draining off laptop.
Yeah, take your time. My fate's sealed, so. I'll just hang around here.
I'm really sorry for the delay.
Hey, no problem. Can I be seen and heard now? When a team's third speaker spends 4 minutes begging you to think of the children rather than responding to our analysis, it's generally a pretty good sign that they know that they have lost the debate. And the second sign that they know they've lost the debate is to just examine the harms that they tell you will occur to children. They tell you children will be traumatized. They tell you parents and kids will not form bonds. Just ask yourself, do these seem like things that are occurring right now? Do most parents not have bonds with their children? Do most children appear to be traumatized and unable to function? These things are just not true, and they are why this team loses the debate. What I'm going to do is go through the 2 ways we win, firstly on economics and secondly on families. Let's start with economics, because we explain here that people are far, far poorer and that things like welfare, safety nets will not exist, and things like medicine and technology will be far worse. This is literally plunging the world back, say, 100 years in time in terms of economic development, a harm of such magnitude that it wins its debate very clearly on its own. And our claim here is really simple, so it's very odd that 3 speakers failed to engage with it properly. We say that when less people work, less goods and less services are produced, which makes sense because there's less people working. And importantly, we point out that money is just kind of like fake, right? Like money is just a claim on goods and services that have been produced by someone. The piece of paper is not inherently valuable. So it's not possible for everyone to get much richer if there are just less goods and services in the world. Because the thing that makes you rich is actually having lots of food or technology or other good things, not having lots of zeros in your bank account, which is why people are just obviously much poorer. But we then combat their like very weird claims. The first thing they say is that wages will rise. We say, well, there are fewer workers, so companies need to pay them more to attract them. But we say there's also less demand for stuff because there's fewer people who earn an income and consume. Because people who don't work don't have incomes and can't consume. So there would also be less money available to corporations to do so. But secondly, we just say that this is not the way that things generally work, right? Like generally wages do not randomly rise without any additional productivity arising. That's kind of what we've seen. The second claim is that prices will go down because people are now much poorer, so companies know they need to drop prices in order to sell goods. But we would say that if this claim was true, poverty would not exist because countries where people are poorer would just be countries in which companies sold goods at much lower prices, and those people would be equally rich as people in richer countries. Obviously, when people are far poorer, they can buy far fewer goods and their lives are far worse as a result. And the impact of this was really huge, right? Because we explained it meant that far, far less people, like nearly half of the people who work currently do not anymore, which just means that you have like half as much stuff, half as much food, half as big a house or whatever. There was far less innovation because there were far less people working on things like economic research. And importantly, when those people who aren't working need to be supported by people who are working, So far, far more of everyone's income just had to go to feeding people who weren't working themselves and could not go to other things that made life worth living, like art, like entertainment, like all of those other things that we really liked. This was a world in which, for example, the smartphone was not invented as soon because there were far fewer innovators. And when it was, far fewer people could afford it because they didn't have the discretionary income to do so. And that meant things like millions of people or like billions of people across the developing world not having instantaneous access to education and information and content. Like this was such a devastating harm in the debate that we just had to win right there. All of their analysis was just trying to escape basic economics. Like you can go around in circles all you want, explaining why companies will do this or that, or will invent extra income out of nowhere. But at the end of the day, if there are just fewer things being produced, people must be poorer. There is no escaping that fact. Secondly, then, let's deal with the issues of families. Because this was their only path to victory in the debate, was to explain to you that this benefited families really significantly. But we will explain, in fact, that this is a norm that is toxic to every actor that touches it and makes the world far worse for families. Firstly, let's examine the issue of path dependency, because they very heavily rely on the idea that you'll be able to opt into this role relatively fluidly and it will occur relatively fairly. But we say that that is unlikely, because this norm says that around 50% of people should stay at home and 50% should work. We agree it would not be gendered, because of course the info slide tells us, but obviously society would have this expectation and would expect you to make that decision early, right? They're like, why would you lock yourself out of working early? Why would you lock yourself out of a high prestige career and so on? Well, for the simple reason that like people lock themselves out of going to medical school and becoming a doctor, or lock themselves out of becoming an engineer, because you have to make choices about how you spend your time and money. And very few people are going to drop $50,000 to get a university education for a very specialized career that they don't think they will use because they want to be a stay-at-home parent and because society tells them they're likely to be a stay-at-home parent because there's a 50% chance that you will. So only people who are highly motivated will do those kinds of things and other people will not. And we say that in a lot of ways, that means people will, at a very young age, be forced to drop out. And the reason this is like obvious is just that think about the real reason people get a university education. How many people get it because it's like fulfilling or whatever? How many people get it because they need a job? And that when they don't get the job, they're really annoyed with that university and really annoyed with life in general. So that explains why you would decide this very early. And that's really bad for them because it explains that the people who make this choice at say 18, when they're not particularly educated, when they probably don't know what their life's going to look like, will now be trapped because they have no source to get into earning a good income. They are now forced into the kind of drudgerous work that this team wanted to avoid so desperately if they ever are unable to stay within that relationship. On the other side, let's engage in the best possible scenario, which is these people get an education anyway. You are now spending huge amounts of resources giving educations to people who likely will never use them, which means money that could have done other things like be spent on welfare or safety nets cannot. Consider the far smaller tax base to fund those welfare services in the first place as well. Secondly, they say this is good for early childhood because now parents can like form a bond with their kids and look after their kids better. We say professional childcare workers can probably also develop rapport with kids and can also look after them well. It was unclear why that was a problem. We also say two-parent households do a very good job looking after kids and also develop bonds with their kids. Secondly, they say this is good for stay-at-home parents because now mothers aren't forced into like gendered roles. We say that this debate presumes a world which is gender neutral in the topic slide when it says both are equally likely to stay at home. But secondly, they tell us like you get to avoid working. We say that's bad, right? Like one, it makes you dependent on someone else. Two, we say that like work is a source of meaning and work is pretty good now. Like maybe in the past it was drudgerous, but now it's often autonomous and meaningful. We also say that things like capitalism will always exist and always make being an income earner be more important than other things. Gender roles alone weren't responsible for that. It was forces like capitalism. They had no response. Secondly, they said this is good for working parents because you know your kids looked after. We say most parents don't fear their kids aren't being looked after by very skilled professional child workers, but now you'll be forced to work much harder because you can't make arguments about work-life balance or family. They say everyone is already forced to work maximally hard, but that belies reality, right? Trends like maternity leave, paternity leaves, benefits, and more holidays are obviously going up, so that is wrong. They say you're less stressed because you know your kids looked after, but we say that's true in either side. You now get no family support. You now bond less with your partner because you see them less. You now bond less with your kid because you're at work all the time and you don't develop a long-term relationship with them. If this team was concerned about bonding with kids, they were far worse on it. But lastly, we then explain why the relationship between both parents is much worse. Because if you spend less time with each other, you just understand each other less. And if you do very different things, you just understand each other less. And when there's a toxic power dynamic where one person controls all the money because they earn the income, and the other person is dependent, you trust each other less and you understand each other less. This was a world in which parents kept their kids home because there was nothing else to do. It was a world in which you were trapped by decisions that you made when you were 18 because society told you to choose either work or stay at home. It was a world in which everyone was less happy, was much poorer, in which welfare didn't exist, and which innovation didn't occur. We were so desperately happy to oppose it.
All right. I thank the third negative speaker. And with this, we come to the end of the substantive half. In order to open the replies, inviting the neg reply. And before that, just a quick reminder to all the teams, like the people who are not speaking could just like simply check in. The check-in is already open. Cool. Negative reply whenever you're ready.
Cool. Okay. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. There'll be 2 questions in this reply. The first question will be, under which side are families poor? And I start with this question because it's the fastest way to side negative to win the debate. Because if more families, the millions of households that we're talking about in this debate, had less access to resources, if the economy was smaller, there were just less things available to purchase, if people had less economic autonomy and less choice and couldn't afford to go on holidays as much more, that would present a far greater impact on the quality of life of those families than any of the maybe even considerable difficulties involved in running a 2-income household. So what are their claims here? Their central claim was this sort of like Malthusian argument that said, if you remove up to half the working age population, wages would go up, but all the goods and services for whom those wages were an input cost would become cheaper. And of course, what we explained was that when you delete half your workforce, that tends to be pretty bad for the economy because there are less people producing things. There are less people offering plumbing services. There are less people building homes. There are less people available to be nurses and doctors. There are less people just broadly engaging in commercial relationships that are mutually beneficial. And overall, that leaves people much worse off. There's less stuff, you earn less income. And that's why Third F was so foolish to kind of lean into the sort of performative credulity that they were going for when they were kind of trying to accuse us of not having read an economics textbook. You didn't need to have read an economics textbook to understand our case. Everyone has less stuff. And that means, right, that imagine over a 20-year period, the GDP or the amount of stuff is maybe 30% smaller than it otherwise would be. And that means that millions of households are hungrier for longer. Millions of households struggle to gain access to the middle class for longer. That means the welfare state is much harder to maintain because there is less income to go around. All of that would be very bad. There are other set of claims here where a set of kind of hand-wavy things, like Third F was like, oh, it's probably just colonialism that caused economic growth. That's fine. Historically inaccurate, but incredibly assertive anyway. But the other kind of key push was like, oh, well, companies will profit hoard, and that's unlikely to have any effects on production, and therefore there'll just be less profit hoarding because companies will now just take their big profits and give it to workers. But what we explain at second negative is that a massive permanent increase in labor costs because there are now fewer workers, and a massive permanent decrease in overall demand because there's now half as many consumers, means that if companies had profits to hoard, they wouldn't be able to hoard them for very long. They'd likely have to close stores, shutter their operations, fire workers, and broadly readjust to a world where there was just overall a smaller economy and a smaller set of economic operations. And all of that meant that families would be poorer, and that would be incredibly harmful in this debate. Because obviously, while wealthier families might be able to insulate themselves a bit better, the families who are right on the cusp of, for example, being poor or being on the cusp of being middle class, they would be the ones who would be harmed the most in that debate. All of that is suggestive that we already have won the round on the basis of that element to the debate alone, because the harm there is it applies to millions of people and is just less overall growth, less overall access to material health and success, less ability to have the free time and the income to be able to go on things like holidays or enjoy the parts of life that make life particularly enjoyable. So let's move on to the second question. Which side is left better for children? The most important question here is, what is the relationship between the parents? Because divorces tend to be incredibly painful for children and very difficult. So if we can prove that parents are worse off, then children are like to be as well. We explain that parents have less time, they understand each other, and that resentment builds up because of the income disparity. All of that suggests that parents are likely to dislike each other, to get on less well, and that is going to be worse for children than both of the parents having to work jobs and having to juggle that. All of which was to say was two-income households really weren't that bad, and economic growth was pretty good, all of which explains why we win.
I thank Meg reply, inviting Yash reply.
Hi, just check Mac and be heard. The strategy of this negative team to win the debate is to insist that there will be less production in the economy without any analysis. When that argument is then rebutted, they then respond by saying the same argument without analysis again and not dealing with any of the underlying problems pointed out by our team. What are the underlying problems that we pointed out with this argument? The first problem that we pointed out is that this argument does not engage with our material about the current oversupply of labor and the rise of productive capacity in the market, which is to say that their argument relies on you believing that at the moment we are producing the optimal amount of stuff for us, and that if we had fewer workers, we would drop below what we need and we would have less than what we need. But our argument from first explains to you that the current economy has more workers than it needs, and it can produce more than it needs, which means that they needed to explain to you not just that there would be a drop of workers and therefore less stuff produced, but that there would be a drop of workers and therefore the market with its enormous oversupply of labor and oversupply of productive capacity would not be able to adjust accordingly. Secondly, they do not deal with our material that explains to you that the labor undersupply is unlikely to be targeted in the harmful ways that they point to, which is to say that you're not going to be seeing 50% of food production drop. It's likely that that is pointed towards the unnecessary kind of production, like for instance, the production of random microprocessors, or for instance, the production of random academic papers. And they never explain to you why the market wouldn't correct in the way we describe by saying that the wages in important industries would naturally rise to attract people towards them. So even if you did believe their argument and believe that the productive capacity of the current market wasn't where we flagged it at, the average reasonable person knows it's at, you would then need to believe that the market wouldn't be able to correct, and overnight, half of farming would just disappear. Not the harm they've described. But finally, we outweigh this argument, because even if you believe that the iPhone is delayed by 5 years, that needs to be weighed against the economic arguments that we make, which are firstly, that we remove the shackles of the overwhelmingly forced expectation for individuals to spend 60 years of their life performing labor that they never see the benefits of. And this team never has an argument to get out of that other than claiming that work is rewarding. Work is not rewarding. It shackles you to a life where your back is broken and your mind is stolen from you. And this team needs to explain why half the population being freed from that would not be an enormous benefit we can claim. But secondly, we outweigh it by explaining that there are other corollary economic benefits that remove their argumentation from working and provide a benefit for us, by explaining that wages would go up, which they in fact then concede by arguing that would be bad because money wouldn't go towards R&D. And you need to ask yourself, what's more important? Apple having the ability to spend more money on R&D, or Apple actually paying its workers a fair living wage? The average reasonable person would certainly vote for affirmative in that case. But secondly, by explaining that prices would go down to accommodate for instance, the lack of purchasing power in the economy. They claim that, well, if that's true, why aren't prices low in countries with poorer consumers? They are. Bizarre argument. Now, even if you don't believe all of that argumentation about the economy, we also explain to you that the government would be able to intervene with things like surplus spending and things like injection of capital into the market that would correct for the problems they describe. Clearly, the winning strategy they have was not properly explained, was thoroughly rebutted, was not properly impacted, and most importantly, isn't the most important argument in this debate. What is the most important argument in this debate? Children. Because all of us were children one day, once upon a time, and all of us will have children one day. And the impact to those children that we explained from first is enormous, because the current atomized world in which children are ripped from their parents, are ripped from the ability to develop into happy, healthy people, has brutalized them. And none of our underlying analysis has been challenged. All they claim is that these harms don't actually occur in the status quo, and therefore our claims are ridiculous, which is ludicrous. The average child nowadays has a far higher rate of anxiety, depression, and all sorts of harms that are inflicted upon them that have never existed in the past. The average child today does not know their parents, and that is the harm that we solve most cleanly in this debate. All their other arguments about children are either sexist, by indicating that it is bad for children to be gendered in a certain way, or rely on you believing absurd things, like parents would willingly traumatize their children because they have no idea how to parent. Clearly, that issue is the most important. And you need to weigh that against any of their material about parents, which firstly is best won by us by explaining that half of parents now don't have to work, an enormous benefit, but secondly, relies on you believing absurd analysis that is overcome by our initial analysis. Like, for example, believing that relationships would become worse without understanding how the norm changes relationship. Like, for example, believing that people being educated more would somehow drop the amount of welfare spending that exists. This team is relying on you believing flashy words at third without actual analysis and hoping that they can case shift their way to a victory. They did not. We won.
Right. I thank the negative reply speaker, and I simultaneously thank. All right. Hi, everyone. Just confirming if both the teams are here. Affirmative, negative?
Affirmative here.
Great. Negative?
Neg are here. Brendan's not. Hang on.
Do you want to wait?
Like 30 seconds.
All right. We'll just wait.
But if he elapses that time, fuck him. Just go for it.
Just let me know, like, if you get some updates. Like, I'll start in like 30 seconds otherwise. Yeah?
Yeah, just go for it. He's pretty sick, so he might be unwell.
All right, no worries. Cool. First of all, thank you so much for such an excellent debate. You must have already noted by the kind of delay that was there in discussion that this debate was really, really close. So the way we're going to go about this in like the oral adjudication is on 3 levels. Firstly, I'll tell you the verdict. Second, I'll tell you some general comments regarding this debate. But thirdly, in terms of going into the RFP, that's the reasoning for decision as to why we thought that the debate went on by telling you what the metrics were of judgment. Right? So starting with the verdict, I thought this was, first of all, like, again, it was an excellent debate on a very close margin. I think it was a negative win. So congratulations, negative. I felt like why this was to a certain extent close, especially in terms of general feedback that I want to give. I think at a point in time, you go ahead and talk to me about a lot of things in terms of the benefit that you argue. I still think to a certain extent, even if you tell me there's a weighing in terms of say like these stakeholders are really, really important and this is what it leads to larger benefit, I honestly don't think you probably do much enough job as to say like telling me what the impact that you're trying to talk about is literally the most important thing in this debate and has to be catered to. I.e., probably it is absent right now within the status quo, and that is why probably you want to create those sort of benefits because it leads to XYZ benefits at the end of the day to begin with. But secondly, I think to a certain extent, there was like larger also lack of responses to a certain extent in terms of actually drawing comparatives and telling me as to why on a comparative you're better. I think that's sufficiently there on few arguments, but it's kind of lacking in terms of say like other few arguments that are there. So I think that's of asymmetry still there in terms of engagement because there's sufficiently good engagement with 1-2 arguments, but there's also lesser engagement with like other few arguments that exist in this debate. In order to like not waste time, I'm going to go ahead in terms of select the larger feedback that I have. There are 3 particular issues and 3 particular metrics on which I judge this debate. Firstly, again, like largely in terms of like where do you have like better world? Firstly, in terms of like micro benefits, but secondly, in terms of like the macro world to begin with. Under micro, we have just like 2 sub-levels. Firstly, in terms of children, second in terms of parents, and macro in terms of like the larger economy and larger society in and of itself, right? Firstly, in terms of children, I think what do I get from affirmative is largely in terms of like how we want to create benefits of children to begin with, which means that we probably want to create this aspect of say like one parent is always there for the early childhood, for better childhood. Secondly, in terms of they're able to form bonds with their parents in terms of say like you having a continual support. But thirdly, in terms of say like parents being able to support support them, in terms of help them, in terms of like homework or anything of that sort to begin with, i.e. in order to make them comfortable, in order to make them happy. But fourthly, in terms of like you having this sort of like monitor behavior, i.e. you're able to just like, figure out a disciplinary nature of say like what your child is doing, etc., etc. So in terms of like supervision, I have two things that comes from negative there. Firstly, I think to a certain extent, they go ahead and are able to prove to me that, listen, we don't think that just because two parents are working right now in status quo, it's absolutely not the case that probably parents do not have, say, like better relationship with their child to begin with. I think that's likely to be true because I honestly don't understand that affirmative goes ahead and actually tells me that why there's a likely possibility that people just generally have absolutely bad relationship with their children right now. And that is why we probably want to create this aspect of say like people are able to form bonds with their parents and have that sort of continual support to begin with. I think that sort of, again, importance analysis is somewhat missing from affirmative in terms of actually proving to me as to why this aspect of you creating bond is something that is important, because probably it's lacking in status quo. Because negative is still able to sufficiently prove to me that, listen, we don't think this necessarily means that probably you do not have any sort of relationship with your child to begin with. Even if you spend quality time after your 9-to-5 job at night in terms of like reading books or anything of that sort, you will still have probably like better relationship and probably like to a certain extent relationship with your parents or anything of that sort to begin with. But even if that's not likely to be true at any given point in time, I think they're still able to tell me that, listen, even if there are working parents or anything of that sort, even if they're probably going to go ahead and take professional care in terms of say like having to cater for their childhood or anything of that sort, that absolutely doesn't lead to say like larger like harms for the child to begin with, because at the end of the day, you're still able to select strike conversations, still able to strike relationship with your child to begin with. I think that's largely the reason. I probably don't credit whatever affirmative has to talk about in terms of say like you creating larger benefit. I think to a certain extent it's true in terms of say like you being able to tell me what the future benefits will look like, that probably want to create continual support. But I don't think you're able to tell me what the importance analysis looks like largely, as to say like why it is particularly relevant and probably particularly important. Probably it's like absent within status quo, and that is why you probably want to cater to that, or probably otherwise like the children are absolutely in bad condition. I think negative is sufficiently able to mitigate that to a certain extent by telling me that that's not likely to be true, but also that benefit can exist under their side, even if they work 9-to-5. I don't think they even like the likelihood possibility is still there on negative to actually tell me that you can still form relationship. The status quo essentially functions in that manner. People still give best quality of life to their children at any given point. But secondly, I think even if I go ahead and cater to this aspect of say like, to a certain extent there's just like bad parenting and probably just like, there's bad circumstances that exist, I don't think that necessarily relates to like larger scenarios to begin with. But also I don't think that affirmative does like larger legwork. At a point in time, you're not able to tell me as to why this is particularly relevant, or probably just caters to like larger stakeholder. I think the weighing that comes from affirmative is majorly in terms of say like, children are the most vulnerable people and we have to cater to them. But again, the same premise that it comes from is that why is it important, or probably it's just like absent, and that is why you probably want to create an additional benefit. I think that sort of weighing is somewhat missing. Second, in terms of parents, I think this is where it becomes important. And this is what I would also just like to highlight, that why on affirmative, I felt that matter was slightly under-persuasive, right? Because firstly, if the kind of framing that I get from affirmative is that, listen, there's an enormous decision-making calculus that exists, and that is why probably we want to create that sort of choices that exist to begin with. I think firstly, you want to credit, and this is what you like kind of talk to me about when negative talks to me about this aspect of like education and all of those things, i.e. probably people are just investing so much amount of money within their like education or anything of that sort. And just because now you probably want to create this aspect that one parent has to stay within home, they're probably like, they're likely to do that in terms of like how generation has essentially functioned, i.e. probably even if you go into future, you're still backed by the kind of historical precedences that have been there, or probably like the way you are taught by your parents or anything of that sort, because of the generation that you probably come through and the kind of teachings that is infused within you at all points. But secondly, I think they go ahead and talk about two things here. Firstly, that probably like to a certain extent, people are just like lesser likelihood that they're probably like, that's a higher likelihood that people are more likely to be taught that, listen, you should be probably doing like this or that at a point in time you grow old or anything of that sort, given the fact this is how largely the society has functioned and probably it's largely going to function that way because of the generation that exists. But secondly, in terms of say like them being able to prove to me that how it is is going to be bad just for like, you know, this aspect of say like people being largely not just like coerced or anything of that sort in order to like do work and all of those things by giving up the kind of money that they invest in education or anything of that sort, but rather people who because of this very fact that this narrative essentially exists, people are also discouraged to like go to education or anything of that sort, given the fact they are taught that this is what you have to do because you have to stay at home largely and there's no use for your education. There are two responses that comes from affirmative there. Firstly, that listen, we don't think that's likely to be true because people are just like people. It's very unlikely that people will drop out of education because they do it for knowledge. But B, also like education is kind of a mandate somewhere, or probably just like where it's self-fulfillment aspect of people or anything of that sort to begin with. But even if that's likely to be true, the transition is going to be like really, really easy because people now exist in like a competition. They can do both of those things, etc. In the first breath, you actually tell me that people will still continue education and there's lesser likelihood for people to drop out of work. But at that point in time, I honestly think that all the other benefits that you're trying to talk about is also like lesser persuasive, right? Because at a point in time, you actually don't tell me as to how many stakeholders are literally there. Because if you necessarily talk to me about that, a lot of people will actually not drop out of education and are more likely to continue education. And only the people who make that choice, who probably want to be stay-home parents, are the ones who are being catered to. I'm honestly very, very unsure as to how much benefit that you're able to cater to, how many stakeholders you're able to cater to, but also to what extent your benefits essentially look like. Because I think your benefits just simply extend from this aspect of say like, oh, there's going to be a change of likelihood and somehow some people will live out of like very good life because, oh, you're still doing menial job in corporate structure. You can still enjoy your life within your home or anything of that sort, watch Netflix and have fun to begin with. I think the idea that then necessity becomes important is that even if you want to talk about that emotional labor is something that is going to be important within your side of the house or probably is legitimized, I honestly don't think that why to a certain extent the counterfactual is also not likely to be true. I think negative simply goes ahead and talks to me about that even within on counterfactual, you can still go ahead and have say like parents in terms of like their emotional labor being catered to. In status quo, you probably have that to a certain extent, even if it's like on certain areas, it's just like delegitimized. But I don't think that it's largely delegitimized. You can still have emotional labor or probably are being like, you know, validated for your emotional labor that you do. But secondly, even if a lot of people are just like staying, or a lot of benefits that you claim is actually relevant from this aspect of say like people staying within home and probably are able to like, you know, to a certain extent, do all these benefits like, oh, you know, you're staying then at home in terms of watching Netflix or anything of that sort. But secondly, in terms of all the benefits that you claim that children are going to be really, really better, is actually reliant. A lot of people actually become stay-home parent in the very first place to begin with. When you already have told me a lot of people are just like lesser likelihood that people are like will drop out of education, I don't think to what extent your benefits claim. However, what I credit from negative is that their ability to go ahead and tell me on two levels. Firstly, in terms of like the kind of problem it creates within relationships, i.e. asymmetry of power is going to be exist. I think this was tried to be mitigated by DPM, the second speaker from affirmative, when they go ahead and tell me that, oh, power dynamics will only exist when it actually exists within status quo because the motion assumes that there's equally likelihood that men and women will do it. But I think to a certain extent, negative is still able to tell me that, listen, given the fact that money is the larger factor of you getting that sort of social status, the asymmetry of power is still likely to occur, i.e. you will still have entitlement that, listen, I'm the breadwinner of the family or anything of that sort. That's kind of like going to be like really bad for the other parent to begin with, i.e. to a certain extent, your interactions or anything of that sort to a certain extent will be bad. But even if that's not likely to be true, I think they still go ahead and tell me that, listen, you will still have dependency amongst on the other parent or probably like the other breadwinner who is there. And that is going to be also bad because that is like largely going to be really, really and like a dependent relationship that is going to be exist, and past dependency is likely to be true. At that point in time, I honestly don't think there's larger responses coming too negative in terms of like how this past dependency, asymmetry of power is not necessarily able to exist in and of itself, which I am also persuaded by negative to talk about. But the only mitigatory response that I get is not actually mitigating the larger impact to begin with, because that sort of, sure, on a gender basis, that sort of power dynamics doesn't exist, but larger power dynamics still exist in terms of one earning and the other doesn't. But lastly, in terms of economy, which is like really quick, I think that even if affirmative is able to tell me that wages are going to be really, really high, but I honestly don't think to a certain extent how it is sustainable largely to begin with. The only clarification that comes from government, like the affirmative reply, is that, oh, we're reducing the labor that is unimportant, i.e. probably from the production of microprocessors or anything of that sort, because like labor is like oversupply right now. And at that point in time, it's going to be labor under supply, wages are going to rise. I have two things here. I don't think that's again responded to the negative material when they go ahead and tell me that this is actually not likely to be true, because at a point in time, you have lesser workforce that ultimately means that you have lesser productivity, ultimately means that the corporations have lesser money to actually give out to people. Because the way in it actually manifests is that wages are actually dependent upon, say, like largely not on the basis of, say, like the cost of goods, but largely in terms of how many labor that you have and to what extent you're able to produce money or anything of that sort. That profit maximizing is going to be less. Even if you go ahead and tell me that, listen, money goes out into the market and people just buy it out and buy stuff to begin with, I think the only aspect then becomes is that where that money is actually coming from. However, negative is still able to tell me is that, listen, at a point in time, you have, say, like lesser wages or probably lesser people in workforce. That's largely going to reduce average like aggregate demand that exists. Probably that's likely to be true as well. At a point in time, you're reducing workforce. At a point in time, you have lesser wages going on, lesser transaction essentially going ahead and taking place. That's lesser likelihood for select people just like reduce money, or probably there's lesser people who are working. But even if there exists some like government benefits or anything of that sort, given the fact that lesser people are working, I think you're not able to credit like larger income taxes or anything of that sort, even to just like go ahead and give out credit benefits or anything of that sort, which is like larger benefit that affirmative has to talk about in terms of like government comes in and fills gaps, there are more good policies, etc., etc. I think that's again dependent upon how much money you are able to actually generate in and of itself. I think negative is able to tell me that on a very larger premise that money is not likely to be true. And that is why on like a macro benefit as well, it's going to harm the economy. At a point in time, there's lesser workforce. That is why I give it to negative. Any questions?
Thank you for the OA. It was very good. We don't have any questions, but we will message you now for feedback, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Thank you. Udai, I think we are connected on Facebook, so you can reach out to me on Facebook for like voice notes. Yeah.
Thank you.
And also, commiserations to Sydney for a very closely fought debate. Best luck in the next round.
Yeah. Thank you, adjudicator.